So good evening and a huge welcome to our online audience on YouTube. Hopefully you've seen the instructions, but if you have any questions for our panel as we go through, then please submit them online and we'll get to those at the end. And to our studio audience, it's great to be back. Nice seeing people face to face once again. So I want to thank you all for coming to what probably is the first live event that many of us have done for many months. And welcome to Scaleups, which is this fabulous facility here, a joint venture between Blenheim Chalcot, UK's leading venture builder, and Imperial College, probably the best university in the world. The concept of Scaleups was formed through our own experience at Blenheim Chalcot of building businesses from the ground up over the last 20 years, more than 40 businesses started, and we're now working to create a centre, a fulcrum for that activity here in West London, which hopefully through our partnership with Imperial will become something like the MIT of the UK. So we're really looking forward to seeing that. We are doing a series of these events called the Scale Factor. This is the first one to try and bring some of the expertise in our combined networks to a broader audience, and hopefully you can be involved in many of these going forward. So I'm delighted to introduce a fabulous panel that we have today. I'm going to do a very brief introduction so that we can get into the content. But here, first of all, we have Celia Moore. Celia is a professor of organisational behaviour at Imperial in the Department of Management, and she has a particular interest in ethics and in leadership, so two key themes for tonight. We've got Dave Kirby. Dave's a partner at Livingbridge. They're a private equity investor investing in businesses, typically at a sort of 3 to 20 million profit stage. So he's right there at the stage when businesses are scaling up, and he's on the board of 3 different companies going through that process. And lastly, we have Henrik Hagemann, who is the CEO of a business called Puraffinity. It's a biotech startup making advanced materials that are optimized to capture specific pollutants out of water to help clean and purify them. And he's also a product of the Imperial system, having been an undergrad there and soon to be moving into Scaleups. So welcome to all 3 of you. Delighted to have you here today.
Thank you. Thanks.
So I'll start with you, Celia. You've written extensively about leadership. So why don't you start by telling us, what do you think about when you talk about leadership? What's your concept of leadership?
Well, I have a really broad conception of leadership, as people tend to see their own areas of interest in really broad ways. I think leadership can be exercised from anywhere, and just is the ability to influence people to come on your bus, share your vision, and engage in behaviors that will allow that vision to be enacted. And
so a bit more broad then, so you're talking about leadership throughout the organisation rather than just at the top. So say a bit about leadership through the organisation.
At the top or throughout?
Throughout your,
well,
yeah.
I mean, I think that leadership is anything that people do to encourage, influence, motivate people to enact whatever vision they have. So if you're a CEO, you have a really important vision, so you really want people to get on your bus and enact it with you. So leaders have to do things from both afar and up close. CEOs or leaders of small organizations who are scaling up need to set a vision that people will understand and help enact, even if they don't interact with you on a daily basis. But all of us also interact with people daily, and we need to engage in leadership behaviors up close. So that's consideration, coaching, mentoring, caring, noticing, listening, those kinds of behaviors.
Okay, great, thank you. And Dave, some large organisations espouse this kind of mantra of strategy, structure, people as a way of kind of thinking about leadership, i.e. you agree the strategy, you design your organisational structure to deliver the strategy, and then you put the people in the slots that the strategy dictates. How does that fit with your philosophy of leadership and how you look at the companies that you invest in?
So I think it's quite a linear concept of these things happen in a nice orderly structure, and probably what the last year has taught us is that actually it's anything but linear, and that cycle of strategic ambition and capability is actually a cycle, and we see our job as helping to accelerate the pace at which that cycle can move. So we find ourselves, instead of thinking about strategy setting process, we're talking about maybe you have an overarching goal, but then you're always thinking about what the rate limiting factor is. And that's not a negative lens, it's a positive one. Where should we be spending our time building capability to accelerate the pace of that cycle, to broaden the ambition we can confidently deliver in our sort of typical 3 to 5 year time horizon? And actually, sometimes that can lead you to some quite interesting places. Is it right to start at the very top of an organisation? Or is it right to start somewhere else? You know, typically, if you hire a chief marketing officer, the first thing they're going to do is hire a head of digital customer acquisition. Why should we actually start there instead? And are we happy to make some tactical choices first in pursuit of a bigger strategic vision further down the line? So for me, actually, it is a cycle, and it's the job to make it move as fast as you can.
And what do you do when you inherit through an acquisition a company that has some very good and capable people that don't necessarily have those capabilities in the place that the business needs, in your view, going forward?
So most of the sorts of investments that we do, we're the very first institutional investor or even external party of any kind. So often what we're trying to do is think about what the first few steps are that you want to take in the construct of an overarching vision of building, a winning business in its own market. And I think actually that's quite an important role for an investor. So we've got 35 portfolio companies, and one of the things that's really important is helping to benchmark functional talent and capability against similar sized businesses. If you're in a fairly small company, often maybe perhaps not in London, then you don't have many benchmarks for a CEO to understand where they might be able to, with a few additional hires, be able to really step change performance. So bringing that read across to other functional teams. I think secondly, it's that same point, rate limiting factor. Where do you start first? Often, our model leads us to businesses that have really sort of tried and tested products or services, but perhaps they've not been very ambitious in terms of go-to-market. So often you're led to sales and marketing as a particular place to start, or they're in a market which is digitizing, so you're led to technology. So often that market context and sort of business you're investing in also can lead you to the right place.
Okay, great, thank you. And Henrik, how big is your organisation now? How many staff?
Yeah, so we've just grown to 17 this week.
Okay, and that's doubled in the last 18 months or so, is that right?
Yes, yeah,
Okay.
yes.
So how are you thinking about the leadership that you're going to need to continue your growth? You just raised a decent amount of money. You've obviously got big growth ambitions. How are you thinking about the leadership challenge ahead?
Yeah, so I think there are two elements to it in my view. There is one piece where you have existing roles, but when you move rapidly like a startup, you really have to almost rewrite the job description every 6 to 12 months. So you're thinking about, okay, can this talent and this capability within the team, can they learn the skills that are needed in 12 months' time? And then on the other piece, so as a tech company, we really come out from strong research base, technology, engineering, very strong. Then it's about that go-to-market. It's not just about product market fit, which, okay, you can hit that, great, but the go-to-market strategy. You need to get out to thrive and figure out what are some of the markers for the team that indicate you're hitting the wave. You're picking up the momentum of this marketplace. And I think of it a bit like Celia mentioned. It's like you have to think of these slices for each team where it starts at strategy and then all the way down to implementation. And you have to then see, okay, how much of that slice can this individual on the team take? So sometimes they can learn much more, and some capabilities will get a very large part of that triangle, even if they get the same job spec from the get-go. Let's say we're growing to 25 by next year. Two people join, get the same job spec, they start with that same amount of responsibility, but if they can pick up on those markers, they can get a much larger slice of that. So yeah, it's about experimenting, I guess, in my view.
And have you had any experience in your relatively short life as a company of people who've been unable to grow as the organisation's complexity has demanded more of them?
You're taking it to a challenging part from the get-go. But yes, it's. I think in companies like ours, whenever someone joins, it's a conversation about joining is exciting, but there will also be a possible exit time. And so for us, we had a founding team in the get-go. They were very passionate, very technically strong. But as we then found our product market fit and things really started kicking off, it's that feeling of, well, it's blowing out of our capability, it's blowing out of our skills. And so we had to sit down and actually have conversations about what are your wants and needs and what are the wants and needs of the organization. And at some point, this was 4 years in, we then had to say, okay, well, you can continue here and we will happily have you, but actually your wants and needs in this area are not getting fulfilled. And is it really a need? And then it became a conversation of, okay, maybe you can become a shareholder, but you won't be a full-time employee. And that's a very difficult conversation often to have. And trying to be proactive around it and getting some external help from a HR advisor, etc., that really felt to me like an important part of the process, I guess.
Interesting. So I had dinner last night with a founder who told me that 4 years into his journey, he realized he wasn't actually very good at running a big company, which the company had become. And so with the support of his shareholders, he got a professional CEO in and then stepped back to be a kind of product evangelist. It's probably great when that is done at the instigation of the CEO. But in your experience, Dave, have you had situations like that where it's been the shareholders or the investors' prerogative to encourage that conversation?
I think, this starts long before you invest. I think typically, as I said, we're often the first institutional investor in a business, and I think you want an open conversation that says, what are you looking to do? Where do you want to be in 5 years? I was at dinner with a management team on Tuesday, and that was exactly the conversation. And I think the more open you are, the better you are able to actually view your investment as a solution to that particular problem set, and to do these things in a planned and measured way, building succession over time, thinking about actually, is this a gradual transition or is this going to happen fairly quickly? Is it right to do this early or is it right to do this partway through an investment journey once you've achieved a sort of first set of objectives? Of course, in practice, people also change their minds, so it's always it's a fairly regular dialogue. And if you were to look back, you would see that many of the times we've invested alongside a founder team, some of that team are not there at the end, but almost always that's been as a result of something that's been planned, discussed, and feels very, very consensual. One of the reasons for that is we're often a minority investor, so everything is done through partnership, and the reasons for us to do it like that are trust takes a long time to build and can be eroded in one or two moments of acting in the wrong way. So it's really important that when any potential founder talks to any of our previous investees, that's the same story that they hear back.
Right. And Celia, you must have observed lots of organisations going through that growth phase where the original founding team have been outgrown by the complexity of the business. So what have you observed works well in that transition, and what advice do you give to founders in that situation?
Well, I think both Dave and Henrik are really articulate about this already, which is we need to ask ourselves and the people we work with, what is it that you want, right? Does the current situation fit with your values, fit with your interests, fit with your ambitions? And to be honest with yourself about that and others, and to be able to have those hard conversations that are hard, because humans are not that rational and not that predictable and not that always easy to have difficult conversations with. So it takes a lot of courage and sort of maturity to be able to sit in those rooms at those tables having those conversations. And I don't know that we always prepare people well for that. You enter a business like yours with excellent technical expertise. I don't know how much training there is in a STEM undergrad about how to deal with those conversations about people, right? Which takes a long time to learn, or you need to have really good intuition. So I think that what I've seen is that people do better if they are self-aware and have a degree of humility. And I don't mean self-abasement. I mean self-awareness and an understanding of their best role in the overall picture. That's when things go well. That's why often founders will want to make a change. It's like, actually, I like starting things. I don't want to deal with all these new HR processes, and I don't want to do that. I want to start a new business, right? So then they'll make a transition that is consensual and planned, and yeah.
Okay. All right.
I'll just pick up on it. Please. I think so. I had a conversation just today with one of our London investor, Kindred Capital, like some of the other founders, and this was the topic, right? We were getting together as founders, and I think there's this sort of schizophrenia. So on one hand, we have many of the top 5 performing VC-backed investments are founder, CEO-led. And then on the other hand, you have founders including some of these joining, where they're like, well, you know, I don't know if I should be CEO. It's like, am I underperforming? And that sort of, then it comes up to that conversation with the board, where you have some of these different perspectives on this panel, where basically you say, maybe we should find someone else, and you find that in many cases they build an exec team around the weaknesses of the CEO. So they might be like, okay, they're awful at HR, build in someone for HR. They're awful at operations, build in someone for operations.
And when there's nothing left?
Right? Yeah. So I think, it's very pertinent to this sort of, search for the unicorn, or search for the outlier performers.
Is it okay? Sorry. If
jump in, please do.
I have a paper about this that's called Squires, right? Where I actually think that's a good strategy. We can't be, not to fill in all of the roles, not to do everything, but to know what your weaknesses are, and then build either for yourself or for your team. You know what, I'm not good at that. And you look at a lot of very charismatic founders. People like Richard Branson, or there's lots of examples, and they have people in their team that often they've worked with for 30 years that play this role of this other role that they don't meet, right? I think it can be a really successful strategy.
We consciously talk about scaffolding, which is, I think, a nice metaphor for what you're trying to build something really tall. You need to put the scaffolding around it to get it there, and actually that can be sometimes about skill set, but equally as often is about style and personality. So you meet a management team, they're really dynamic, creative, but there's no completer finisher in the team. There's no one who's prepared to take the contrarian position in a discussion to get to the right outcome. There's no one who is maybe more risk conscious, or equally there's no one who's willing to take bigger risks. And you might choose to, when you bring in someone from the outside, to not just fill the skill set, but fill the personality type that rounds out that team.
Okay, and Henrik, in your example, you started by talking about a CEO who's starting to question whether they are right for the job. The fact that they're questioning probably puts them in the lower risk category versus the people who think they've got all the answers and are unaware of the gaps. And I'm guessing for you, Dave, that's the most challenging situation, whether that's a CEO, whether that's a functional leader that's come in as part of a founding team. Have you had any experience of that, and any tips for investors or advisors in the room for how to address that kind of situation?
So if someone doesn't have that sort of self-awareness.
Doesn't have that self-awareness or humility.
It actually, it's more often than you would think. It is a really big tell to us when a business that has brought on senior talent, not because anyone's told them to, not because they've got a board where they've talked about talent roadmap, they've just gone, actually, we need to level up, and it might only be one or two, and you might still think, actually, to unlock this, we need much more. But that's a really powerful sign that a business has thought about what it needs to do to unlock its potential and has gone and done it, and actually has been able to attract top talent. Often you probably in that process have ironed out how you bring on a new experienced professional to a well-formed senior team that's probably been there for a while. You've ironed out that kink. You've thought about actually how you go and make a senior hire. I mean, it's amazing the number of founders you meet, and you talk about what it takes to land. That this person should be paid half of what I'm paid, get nothing, and basically lift up their whole life and live in another part of the country. And you go, no, that's probably not going to work here. So I think that's a really powerful tell. Equally, it's not always the case that that's happened, and so then you're trying to work out, well, is this because the business has just not needed to think about like this? You've just got a team, maybe they've founded a business before, they're experienced, they bring that outside context and capabilities through other means, or is this actually someone that, or a team that isn't thinking strategically about what they're trying to build, and that's normally, if you work that out, that's normally a conversation that doesn't go much further. So you normally try and spot this well before you invest, hopefully.
Okay, great. Now let's talk about the transition all businesses have gone through in the last 18 months, and clearly while we're starting to go back to work, it's going to be a different kind of hybrid working environment than we had before. So Celia, what have you learned about how leadership works in a remote world over the last 18 months, and what do you think what from that learning do we need to carry forward in the kind of hybrid life that we're likely to lead going forward?
I think there's been a lot of really good lessons learned and a lot of things that I think we need to be really careful about going forward. I think especially working women with kids have spent the last 2 decades saying, no, we can work from home. I promise we can work from home. We can do this, we can do this. And there's been a lot of organizations that are like, I don't really think you can, right? Yeah. And then in like 2 months, like, oh, look, we can. So that is a really excellent shift that has unlocked a lot of potential. I think we've also realized that the burden placed on caregivers has been incredibly detrimental, and that has also been disproportionately placed on women, so we need to be careful about that. I think that it has provided opportunities for a lot of innovation that we hadn't thought of before. So I don't think I'll be going into a fully face-to-face classroom for a long time, which makes me kind of sad because I'm so excited there are people in 3 dimensions here. I'm wearing shoes.
So just on that, are you saying that you don't think there will be face-to-face teaching at all, or that there'll be people in the room and there'll be cameras as well for the people at home?
Solely face-to-face.
Okay.
Or I think that then we'll segment the market so that there'll be, elite only face-to-face classrooms, and then there'll be hybrid classrooms as well. But I think that we've needed to be more mindful of the ways in which this new way of working has also burnt people out. It's been a long pandemic, and there will be cracks that I think we'll continue to see for a little while still.
It's interesting. There's been a lot said about the demonstration of the previously obvious but not well understood fact that women particularly can work effectively from home. But I've also had a lot of dads saying, you know what? I've actually realised I like my kids. I've spent time with them over the last 18 months, and it's been a pleasure. So I think hopefully for all of the family, it's been really positive. But back onto the leadership thing. If you touched on the fact that a lot of leadership is about the softer side of things, the EQ, the empathy, and so on. What have we learnt about how to deliver that through a remote interaction? Start with you, Celia, and then we'll come to the others.
So I think there are, again, some things that are great and some things that are less great about virtual leadership. I think that we have become accustomed to on-screen seeing and being able to read people's faces a little bit better. I know that there's a lot of ways in which I can create a more inclusive classroom online than I always can face-to-face. So I can call out people and make sure that people are contributing more equally, and I can, the activity in the chat means that people who are not always as confident speaking up can participate in a way that is harder to do in a traditional classroom. So I think that is true of meetings as well. But I think all of those informal interactions, right? Getting coffee, seeing each other outside, or running into each other at the tube, losing all of that has meant that those daily, tiny opportunities to notice have been absent, and I think that is a loss that we need to figure out how to manage.
And start with you, Henrik. How are you kind of managing the transition?
I was just thinking about that, like opportunity of loss, opportunity to meet. I think obviously it's been a great forcing function to get people to be able to work from home. But I think it's also about how can we enable this sort of behavior so that we don't end up with the worst of both, with the worst of working from home and the worst of working from the office. So for us, we've had to do things like investing in people's home working equipment or doing checks. Are they actually like working somewhere they don't like break their back sitting there? And then stepping into that unstructured time. So we've actually had to think about an experiment. These are experiments. So we've experimented with putting in place unstructured time, whether it's like having lunch together, because we used to have lunch together. We're social animals, where before our tribe used to be at work. And this forcing function shifted our tribe to being our neighbors or our flatmates, our family, where some met their kids for the first time in a while, or properly met them. But I think we do those sort of experiments to see how can we play to the tribe also at work. without taking away from this new area of life we've built up. So we have something like three days a week, even as a physical goods product company, we have 3 days a week in the office, 2 days a week working from home. And some days when you have a lot of data analysis, a lot of data to run through, you can work from home that whole week. And we're even thinking of work from anywhere, where we have 17 people, 11 different nationalities. When they go visit their family, why not stay a few extra weeks where they can work from there? If it's Portugal or Venezuela or Singapore, actually it's not an issue. And I think it's also learning about asynchronized work. We're so used to having to work when we're in the same room at the same time, but there are a lot of benefits we can try and unlock by having asynchronized work. Go do deep thinking and then reconvene and send over material. Those are definitely some big challenges.
And the anecdotes I've heard have said that where you've got an established culture and established network of trust amongst colleagues that were together before the lockdown, that kind of stuff works well. But where you've hired people that have never met face to face, and with a business like yours that's grown a lot over the last 18 months, how have you managed that kind of onboarding and culture assimilation and so on?
Yeah, so it's like seeing people I've been working with closely for 9 months. I've never met them face to face. And you meet face to face, you're like wondering, are they going to think I smell? Do they think I'm going to be very,
Say,
very
wow,
tall?
you're tall. I have no idea. Yeah.
Those sort of things where you're just like, okay, I have no idea. And I mean, we've tried to set up these recurring unstructured lunches where they get a voucher. So we use platforms for like them to get food delivery so that there is some sort of incentive, I guess. Unstructured time and then talk together. Or we have socials where we have games nights, and people get these sort of vouchers for like a takeaway platform. We can just issue all of those out, again, using technology to try and overcome some of these barriers. And then we spent time together. It's not as good, but you're learning then, experimenting, I guess.
There's one company I worked with that had a whole bunch of interns during last summer, and they all went to the office, and essentially there was a chat that was open from 9 till 5, and everybody just worked at their desk in there, even if they're working quietly, just so that you could always say, unmute and say, oh, does anyone know how to do this, in the way you would do to the person next to you.
Yeah.
And then they would break off to another Zoom chat if there was an actual meeting, and then come back to it. And I thought that was quite an interesting way of creating some of that corridor conversation, if you like, even when you're in different places. Yeah. Dave, what about your portfolio and your organisation, actually? How have you managed that?
I think the thing that I take probably from what Celia and Henrik have said is that the key is understanding your own organisation's culture and context, which is, in our portfolio, we've got, on one hand, digital marketing agencies through to very traditional insurance businesses. And if they were answering this question, they'd answer it in really different ways. And I think we've learned that we can't bring a one-size-fits-all approach to it. I think the thing that you do have to do is think about the key rhythms and sort of rituals and ceremonies in your organisation's day, week, month, and how they're going to play out, and be thoughtful about it. And also probably know that's going to change in 3 months' time, and keep thinking about it. From a personal experience point of view, I've actually been on a board now since June last year, a business we invested in, actually in Ireland, and we've not met in person since we did the investment. And of all of the things that I think are hardest to do remotely, collective decision making and judgment and difficult conversations are probably up there in the top 5 things hardest to do. And I would add that probably formation of a new group. We've not been through the normal stages of forming an effective group. We've not fallen out. We've not got cross. We've not felt hurt by things. We've not had shared experiences to refer to and have in those 10 minutes before the meeting starts to chat. We don't know each other. So what we've done is actually used a business psychologist to actually facilitate a very considered and deliberate evaluation every 3 months of what's working for this group, what's not working, based on an understanding of our own innate preferences and ways of working, to sort of contract about how we're going to sort of have slightly harder conversations, be more pointed in what we're doing, stop being so nice all the time, in pursuit of a better quality of conversation. And that's been really effective. That's something we've done in quite a few investee companies. But I don't know, I hope we're not doing virtual board meetings in 6 months' time, and I think that will pass. So, even in our own organisation, and we're all sort of fairly, probably on the get back in the office end of the scale. But what we're exposing is that there are people now in our own organisation who can't still, and that has made us think quite hard about have we jumped the gun a little bit on some areas and reflected a bit more, which has been useful.
So for all of the entrepreneurs in the room and those on the online, you're all probably thinking, yeah, I wish my investor wasn't so nice all the time. All right, let's go to a different area now. Hopefully, as we come out of lockdown, there's been a massive acceleration of digital adoption across the economy. That's good for a lot of the tech businesses that you guys certainly represent, hopefully a period of growth. But it's also a period where everybody else is trying to grow their technical skills and capabilities. There's enormous competition for the kind of talent that scale-up businesses need, with the remote experience that we've had over the last little while also meaning that big companies can kind of poach people from anywhere, even if they're not geographically close. So what are your thoughts on how ambitious scale-ups that don't necessarily have the salary resources of the big guys, how they can compete for the kind of talent they need? Celia, what are your thoughts?
Well, I think competing for talent always involves more than salary. And I think we often overestimate the role of salary and whether someone wants to come to a job and likes the job, stays at the job, is a good fit for the job. So for me, the worry is, how do you demonstrate what the culture is of your organization so that you can determine whether or not there's going to be a good fit? And I think one of the things that we've seen over the course of the pandemic is that people have really reconsidered what they want out of life, right? And I think it is more, for many people, it is more leisure, less continuity, more learning, right? So it's always about thinking about the whole package of things you can offer as an employer that goes way beyond salary, right? What kind of opportunities, how big can the bottom of the pyramid be? How quickly can you get people engaged in things that they might not have expertise in, but which you could show them so that they can continue to learn? What other fundamental human motivations can you tap into, right?
Yeah, makes sense. Other thoughts?
I mean, I think this is going to be a defining trend in the next 2 years at least. I mean, I tell you, the pressure on recruitment, not just in technology, across every role across our portfolio now, is the greatest I've seen it. There are processes are, roles are taking longer to fill, big inflation in salaries and costs just to close candidates out, and having to move exceptionally quickly. I'm on the board of a marketplace business, and we are recruiting people from end to end in a day. So I think one of the big drivers is just making sure your process is exceptionally efficient, and that you're very, very clear about what you want. Because if you're not clear about what you want, you can't move quickly, and you're actually using the hiring process as a bit of discovery to refine what you want. And into this market right now, that's a recipe for failure. I think also actually having a really clear story about what you're building has always been important, and now that's as important as ever. And that can't just be in the CEO's head, that has to be in the people at every stage of the interview process. I mean, the balance of time we are spending selling versus buying has gone from maybe 10-15% to 30-40%, especially for senior hires, and maybe even more than 50% selling. And then you're using other means of assessment, so more referencing, through your network, through third parties, so that when you're actually face to face with the candidates or on a screen with the candidates, you're selling the opportunity. But that is the number one thing we're talking about.
Interesting.
Yeah.
In fact, a number of the businesses in the Blenheim Chalcot portfolio have got some kind of social purpose at the core of what they're doing, and finding selling increasingly heavily on that has real value. A lot of people, as you said, Celia, have reassessed their life priorities and working for an organisation that they think is adding some value to the world versus just a route to earning money seems increasingly important. And one tool that has worked well is actually writing a pitch deck as part of the recruitment process. And when you invite a candidate to interview, you send them the pitch deck, which is pitching not the company to investors, but the company to employees and why it's important. And that's increasingly part of the standard process.
Yeah, I wanted to, I guess, add the contrarian view here on this. I think there is, in some sense, this is a chance for an equalizer of many of the things that have skewed the talent access. And so I think if you're clever about it, and if, again, the culture comes back to this, but you can tap into a lot of extra talent within this sort of more diverse space because of being able to call in from Zoom. You're not only limited to the networks that you have from your founding team members. You can advertise things, and if you can tap in, there are two things that are difficult about it. One, do they have enough talent or enough potential? And two, do they want to bite at the salary we have? And so I think one thing that we find is increasingly important is trying to look at what they've built before. Even if it's not a company, even if it's not let's say a project at work, those things can become great markers of self-awareness, of like, maybe they've built something at a university society, or they've built a small company and sold it, or they've built a project within a large organization. Those things we really pick up on, and we find that for some roles we can tap into more diverse talent by representing who we are. So we say, hey, we have these non-value-based stats, whether it's ethnicity, age, gender, whatever else. And then they're like, oh, these guys, they do implement diversity and inclusion or whatever. They asked like for the metrics rather than saying, listening to what you've written on your website. Like, I think you can tap into more if you can make this what you do, not just what you say, let's say. It's about those actions. And then maybe having it in a pitch deck. These are our stats, these are our things, yeah.
But that's actually the corollary of an incredibly hot talent market is keeping hold of the people you have.
Yep.
And it's easy to just focus this lens on the employee value proposition just on your recruitment activities. And I think you do that at your peril, because if you see what's coming in the market now, you can bet that your top talent is being talked to by your competitors, people in other industries. And I think actually we are sometimes guilty, and others maybe feel this as well, of growth is a great motivator for probably most of the people in this room, but across organizations it's actually not that great of a motivator. It's more about the purpose you're solving, the people you're working with, what it feels like to work in the place you work. And we've got a lot of businesses in industries like healthcare and education where that's especially true. And actually, if the time you spend getting that right, and the narrative about actually why we should have targets to work to, well, it lets us reinvest in the proposition or build extra facilities or achieve better outcomes for our service users. Often that's the work we find ourselves spending time on in order to create that employee value proposition and keep people. And I think that's especially true now.
And if you're investing in or encouraging your companies to invest in one thing to improve the employee value proposition, to keep people from leaving and going somewhere else, what would you put top of the list, all three of you?
I think we use something called employee net promoter score. So we think of employee experience, basically. And so we do surveys once a month. There are lots of emerging tech companies within this space, but we do some surveys, and these surveys have a theme each month, and we try and see, okay, what is the sort of employee experience from that survey? Maybe last one was about manager effectiveness. Are their managers any good? Should we train them? Or sometimes it's about health and safety. Do we need to fix health and safety in some elements, or something slips between the cracks? And I think then we presented at town hall and we talk about, okay, you said, we did. And I think closing that loop to feedback, getting implemented, and they see some action, we've definitely seen an improvement in our employee net promoter score. And I think of it really as an important metric next to profitability or tech results, etc.
And your point about management, I read once that people join a company but leave a boss. And so I think that's pretty wise, and investing in management, particularly helping young new managers to learn how to do it without killing the people they're managing, I think is money well spent.
Yeah.
Any other thoughts on that question?
I think it's so specific to the organisation. I have three invested companies that I'm on the board of, and it's different in each context. In one, it's absolutely understanding the employee experience and measuring and dealing with it. In another, it's a very young company, and it's training, it's learning and development opportunities, and in a way that actually is sort of multimodal. To sort of Celia's point about being in the classroom versus being remote, actually it's a global business, so that's ever more true. And I have another where actually they've just undertaken quite a big strategic pivot, and the investment they've made is to build out very significant capability to let each individual in product, tech and marketing teams spend 25% of their time on the strategic projects, in different groups of people, as well as the day job. That's quite a big bet to do, but it just unlocks. It seems to unlock something else, some new energy, some real refocusing on this new direction that would have been there before. So I think it's really dependent on the organisation situation.
Yeah.
See, I was about to say something different, which is that humans, I think, have really universal desires, right? Everyone wants to be seen. Everyone wants to be heard, everyone wants to be understood, and everyone wants to be valued. I don't know many people that don't want those four things. So to keep the employee experience positive, right, you need to understand, do they feel seen, heard, understood, and valued?
And I guess when a lot of people are remote a lot of the time, you have to work even harder on some of those angles.
Yeah.
So we talk mostly about leadership in the context of the people who work full-time within the company. But what do you think are the roles at the kind of scale-up phase of mentors and coaches and kind of outside resources to help with that kind of management leadership bandwidth and intelligence? Celia?
Well, I think if you are a leader, it's good to think about having a portfolio of those people, right, that can service different roles as you're growing, right? So the role of a sponsor is different than the role of a coach, is different than the role of a mentor, is different than the role of a champion. And I like thinking about over the course of your career, you don't always, you don't go like find mentors, just mentors sometimes emerge and then you keep them or don't keep them depending on your ongoing relationships. I had something that I was going to say that I just lost my train of thought. Finding people who can, within your own portfolio of talents, can serve as that scaffolding. So when I teach MBA students about leadership, I say, I'm not always so good at saying things in the most diplomatic way. It's a strength sometimes, but it is also a kryptonite. So when I know I need to do that, I have a friend that I've had for the last 20 years named Mark, and I call him up because he's great at it, and I say, Mark, I need to say blah, blah, blah. And he translates that into something that
don't say that.
Well, no, I know that I can't say that, but I can say it to him, and he can translate it, and I write it down word for word, and then I try and have those conversations by some sort of medium that they won't notice that I'm reading from the script. So, I think within ourselves, we need to be aware enough of what our strengths and weaknesses are, knowing that I'm never going to be someone who is naturally like that. That is just not who I am, personality, but I've adapted, I've created the scaffolding around me so that I know now when to make use of the scaffolds.
And Dave, for a company that's in reasonably early scale up, the cost of an external coach or mentor is actually quite a material hit to the P&L. But do you encourage your portfolio companies to make that kind of investment?
Absolutely. Yeah, there would be very few in our portfolio that don't have some of that form now. As to some extent, if you think about how we build our boards, there are normally other non-executives around the board. There's normally an independent chair, and they, to some extent, especially for the CEO, can fill that role. And normally, it's interesting, when you start out a conversation, and you say most of our boards have an independent chair, the mind goes to someone who's got a great network, can open doors for me, contacts. Actually, that's very rarely the right solution. Normally, it's about who will help you to fulfill your potential. And it's normally about fit of personality and background experience that will bring that. Often, I think there's certainly a big part of the mentoring and coaching, which is Celia's point about helping you sort of unlock the shadow side of your strengths, right? And someone said to me once, confidence is equal knowledge of your strengths and your weaknesses, and that's a characteristic that many of our CEOs would have, and they use that to great effect. Sometimes, though, it's not about that. It's about how you find your time to think. actually, and sometimes actually the best mentors in my experience are the ones who say the least, but let you find the space to sort of go away and think through that difficult problem. And often actually we connect people within our portfolio to do that. That's one of the strengths we have, and that's both at a senior level but also at a functional leadership level to make that happen. And sometimes also with past investees who've not just in the journey now but have been through the journey and could have come out the other side and have the scars that are worth sharing as well.
Interesting. And before we go to Henrik, I'm going to ask for audience questions soon, so have a think about anything you'd like to ask the panel, and I'll come to you in a second.
Great. Yes, I'll again at the contrarian view. So we used to use exec coaching for the leadership team, and we realized, hey, this has a massive impact. We would do these short sprints, 3-4 months, focus on one theme, 360 feedback first and at the end. And then we basically talked to our London investor, our lead VC here, and what they came up with is this team-wide exec coaching model. So basically there are 5 themes that people can request coaching for. And again, it's been forced in by this sort of pandemic mode. Everything is delivered via Zoom or via video call, but basically then we're offering coaching for the whole team in like different areas. We find that's quite helpful. We just started it, so it's been a month, 2 months with this now. And then, I think another important element is peer support. Oftentimes we talk about mentors being more senior, or for me it's these sort of like founder support groups where you talk to people who are maybe also leading a team or leading a function, and you have similar struggles, different industry, you're not competitive. For us, we're fortunate our VC set it up, but it really helps because some of the challenges are the same and you can't talk to the whole team about it. That's the other side of the leadership. You have to play a role to your team. And sometimes that means you can't be as buddy-buddy as you would like to be. And then those peer support groups really come in handy. The other things are great as well, but this was just, I guess, another dimension to it.
Okay, great. The last thing before we go to questions, I want to talk a bit about diversity. It's been a very key theme of leadership discussion over the last little while. So talk to me about diversity in its broadest context, about what you are doing with your portfolio companies in your organisation, or what you're seeing in kind of best practice areas through your work and research. Dave, you start.
Yeah, I mean, it's always been an important theme for Livingbridge. I think the private equity firm we were founded by a very diverse group of people in the first place. So it's been reflected in the makeup of our own organisation. What's changed is twofold, which is we're now seeing our own investors who are often very very sort of traditional conservative pension funds and insurance companies starting to bring those questions to us, and also from our investee companies where they're turning to us and going, this is a subject we know is important, but we don't really know what to do. And we've got some leading lights in our portfolio who this has always been part of how they operate, and we've taken best practice and introduced people from those investees to share what they've learned. Equally, we've brought in people from outside in our network who have particular lenses on it. I think the thing we've always been conscious of, I think you made the point, Dan, which is you can't silo this. You have to think about this holistically, and also end to end, from the way you acquire talent, the way you manage talent, the way that you think about even the language you use in your internal interactions. I think we're still learning, to be honest. I think I'm still learning, and actually, what's impressive is how many of our investee companies are still figuring this out and finding out some perhaps difficult to accept truths about their own previous ways of working and addressing them.
And the whole sort of tech ecosystem is still sadly overpopulated by kind of white privileged men, and so where you're helping your companies to recruit a more diverse audience, what have you found that's worked?
I think that, certainly there's been to Henrik's point about a forcing function, there's been a natural change over the last 12 months. We have one of our investee companies, their office is next to a tube station that has no disabled access, and they were actively out there trying to increase the diversity of their workforce, and it wasn't working. As soon as the pandemic started, that's been a massive change for them. and there's been a real, I think a real, there's lots of examples of different ways in which, whether it's people working more flexibly, people working in different locations, people that are, for instance, a lot of caregivers, who have relatives, etc., that need care, coming in through the talent acquisition processes that wasn't there before. But I also think that the challenge is going to be, I expect a lot of these changes in the way we're working now to reverse gradually over 5 years, and how much of this you want to make stick is the sort of debate we're having at the moment.
Great. Other thoughts?
Yeah, I'll pick up on that. So for us, we saw an early thesis in 2014 within the research community where you were seeing outperformance by teams in these sort of synthetic biology competitions that we took part in, representing Imperial, where the more international teams were outperforming the ones that were less international, or the more diverse within non-value-based traits teams. So non-value-based traits are basically the protected traits on the HMRC website, but particularly for gender. And so we were designed as the Imperial team to be 50-50 as a science group, which is, I guess, a bit unusual in STEM, and we did really well. And so we published this report called the I in iGEM, which is the iGEM competition, and it was basically about the internationalism in these non-value-based traits. And so, yeah, that was slightly speculative, but since then we've seen BlackRock come out and say, okay, diverse teams outperform profitably. So we're like, okay, let's try and translate some of these things into the SME space. And so I think what we're trying to see now is these sort of jealousy cases where diverse teams within non-value-based traits outperform both for profit and for this sense of purpose. Talent retention, these sort of things actually performing better. And I think we are starting to see some jealousy cases coming up where they've done that really well, and I hope there will be more. But I think, yeah, saying it's more than just about feeling good. It's also, it is probably higher likelihood of an outlier outcome if you are more diverse. And that helps shift some mindsets. So now I work with this sort of diversity and inclusion group at the Royal Academy of Engineering, where we just try and bring this into engineering SMEs, because we really have no idea. We have no toolkits. It might be in other sectors of the economy, but a lot of these engineering startups or scale-ups, we have awful stats. London, we have 40% BAME. It's so rare to find a startup within engineering or scale-up that has more than 40% BAME. So trying to get that up is, yeah, I think it will, hopefully with the right jealousy cases, become more of the norm, but it's really hard work, I'll say that.
Celia, anything to add?
So the research is really clear, and there's now very, very controlled, empirically rock-hard studies that show that diverse teams outperform non-diverse teams, except diversity has to be managed well.
Yeah.
So if diversity is managed well, then you will not outperform. A homogeneous team performs more easily because, I mean, I often think about, I've been a part of a book club for 13 years. We are all within 5 years of each other. We are all white. We all live in London. And we're like the poster child for the most homogeneous group, right? So we get along, and there's easy conversations, and we agree on what books, like all of that is seamless, right? We learn more and do different things if we were diverse, but we are not. Luckily, we don't have to. We don't have to report to anybody about the lack of diversity in my book group. But in organizations, we need to be a lot more mindful about how to do inclusion, right?
It's difficult.
And it takes longer because there's more translation. There's not as the seamlessness does not exist, and it's that friction that makes the decisions better. Yes. But we need to train people to be comfortable with the slight discomfort that creates.
Yeah.
Great.
Yeah,
Okay.
they like to say that you're trading off short-term discomfort for long-term superior outcomes. When we talk about diversity, and it really is short-term chaos if you don't manage it well. That's the challenge.
Makes sense. So we're going to go to questions now from the audience or any that have come through the online channel. Who's got a question here in the room? would you mind, for people asking questions, would you mind standing up and then just wait for the boom mic to come? So we've got a nice COVID-safe mic which you can speak into.
Well, Celia, you just started answering my question that I'd written down, which was arguably diversity doesn't lead to results. It's the inclusion of diversity. And that quote that I'm sure we're all familiar with, you can be invited to the party, but if you're not then invited to dance, you're not creating the inclusion. So I wondered if there were any ideas of things that you're doing already to create that inclusion within the team, or any great research or ideas. That's my question.
Yeah.
I'm happy to talk about
yeah.
something we're involved in. So working in the city, probably one of the least diverse industry sectors on any measure, and it doesn't take you long to work that out. Particularly through the sort of Black Lives Matter movement last year, our managing partner, who himself has had many experiences in his life of being discriminated against, was involved in the formation of an initiative called 100 Black Interns, which is a program to offer internships in financial services firms to people from BME backgrounds, either last year of school, first, second year of university. Recognising that as the hardest, the first step being the hardest to take. And
I guess that's a role that's nearly always filled through a network, and the networks all tend to be privileged white people.
I get many requests for work experience placements, internships, and actually you probably say yes to the first one, and maybe yes to the second one, and you start thinking, hang on, there's something here that's not quite right. So I've certainly experienced that. And actually that initiative has been so successful, it's been transformed into 10,000 Black interns. Yeah. So my team at Livingbridge, we've been involved in helping to set that up, to build the data infrastructure, the marketing efforts, the onboarding. I mean, that's by no means, that's quite a complicated logistical effort. But the amount of support it's had from the city has been phenomenal. And actually, we've got the first cohort starting next week. I'm mentoring 2 in different city firms. But that, I think, that first access is I hope going to have a pretty significant effect.
And for anyone representing an employer who wants to get involved in that, is it something you can just
Black
sign
interns,
up for?
Yep, you can find it on LinkedIn, and they've got the website up and running now. So yeah.
Great, thanks. Other thoughts on the question?
Yeah, I mean, we don't have 10,000 interns.
Neither do we.
We try to think of, we track these sort of non-value-based traits along our hiring funnel, and also at retention, because it's often like left out. Do you have a tracker for inclusion within an organization? And a tracker really is retention. So do you have different retention across different non-value-based traits for your employees? And I think, yeah, it's often an uncomfortable conversation the first time you have it, but then it becomes trying to test out these experiments with the toolkits that are available. Often we think of what experiment are we going to run this time on the employee experience with regard to our key values, where one of them is like this sort of inclusion piece. It might be changing our social activities. It might be, in some cases, rethinking how our layout is within the office. And other times it will be, this month is Black History Matters, or Black History Month, and so we'll have something. We'll have our Black employees come and present something where it's like, this thing was important to them, and this is something really cool that all of us can gather around and learn about this music or history, or this person in history who's been a great scientist and overlooked. And then when there is stuff like that they're called like hidden figures, which are promoted, whether it's from the Royal Academy of Engineering and others, we actually gather around and say like, that's really cool. How can we learn from them? Or what was the lesson learned? And then we have these mentors come in who give lessons learned presentations. So they might give one to our engineering team and basically talk about what's it like being a minority within this sector, because a lot of them are within engineering, within STEM. And then we learn from them across companies. It doesn't have to stick within our company. We're not 10,000, we're 17, so we kind of have to think of those extra levers to pull. But it is still an ongoing experiment.
Celia, anything to add?
The one thing I just wanted to say is to not be afraid of acknowledging the differences, that the conversations happen when you acknowledge the differences. So there's this very clever psychological study that took place playing the game Guess Who, where you flip up the faces and you have to guess who and if you play the game, one of the things that is the easiest first move is race, right? Because then you can flip down all the faces that aren't whatever color you've just said. But they got people in the US to play this who were black and white, and white people tended not to use race as a criterion on which to play the game when they were playing with someone who was black, because they're like, oh, I'm colorblind, even though it's clearly part of playing this game. And they both the black players against white players and people who were just observing video of the interactions coded white players who didn't want to acknowledge race as part of this game as being less inclusive and more racist than the people that did. So it's sort of like, we have to actually talk about the stuff, seen, heard, understood, valued, to make it work. So sort of lean into the discomfort a little bit and you'll get the rewards.
Interesting. Other questions, please? Just stand up and wait for the mic. Thanks.
As a member of the founding management team of a business that Dan chairs, which is now 6 years old and some 240 people strong, I'm wondering why he invited me to a session where the first topic was businesses outgrowing their founding management teams. But setting that to one side, I wonder if there's an alternative narrative to the difficult conversation narrative, which is, as a startup management team, you have a completely ambiguous environment in which to construct a business. You have clean sheets of paper everywhere. You have no team to do anything. The level of ambiguity, the level of intellectual challenge, the level of thinking things through, innovating everything, putting it all in place is enormous. And as the business grows, and you want to do 400 this year of what you did 300 of last year, or maybe even 200 last year, that starts to diminish. The roles start to narrow. And rather than the role outgrowing the individual, perhaps what happens is the role shrinks so it's no longer worthy of the individual. And if that's the case, does that set up an alternative way of having those conversations and thinking about the difficulty of them?
Thanks. Who wants to take that one?
I think it's particularly relevant actually in the context when one company buys another one. And you're trying to find, you suddenly have two of everything, and you actually need the number of people to do the amount of work they do, but you need to recut people's roles, and actually structures can change, and someone who was in charge of something becomes not in charge of something anymore. I think the framing narrative of your role today might change in ways that you might not think, and that can still be a good thing for you, is a really important one to construct. And actually, if you don't, then you are just setting yourself up for a really awkward conversation. I think creating the idea that depth is as good as breadth is the main way to do that. And actually, it's something that I'm on the board of one company we've now bought 3 other businesses. If we hadn't started with that narrative at the start, we'd have lost a lot of really good people, especially from that middle layer of management.
Yeah.
Any other observations on that?
Yeah, I had one thought where it's just, obviously that's an important part of it, but I think if you can play this right, it's kind of like how we could start celebrating, this is a bit morbid, but celebrating death. It's kind of an outcome which is inevitable if you're successful. And so I think going back to the hiring piece, if you can hire you always have 2 different things at odds. One is trying to have control, and the other one is trying to grow for value where you cannot control it. And some people will want to build a company that's in this category, and others will want to build it for value where they cannot control it. It's for growth, so to speak. And I think when I look at when it's gone wrong in our case or in other cases, it's when individuals are trying to fall into this category of control, and you're growing rapidly, and they're not satisfied with depth rather than the horizontal piece. So if you can have an attitude element within the hiring, and you can hit that piece of the growth rather than control, then you can set yourself up for you will still have difficult conversations, but less awkward. It will be, okay, we've hit this point, you've done really well, we're growing, we're 600 people next year, but now's the time to press this thing. And it also ties in with the CEO conversation. If they really are there for the growth, then they will be welcoming that conversation of, oh yeah, maybe we can no longer scaffold me up. Maybe we need a professional CEO to run it. It's and part of the success.
There's an interesting related issue I've seen both at Google and in some of the faster growing startups I've worked with, which is when you're growing 20% year on year plus, then it automatically creates new management opportunities for the team. And people assume that if you're doing a good job after 2 years, you'll become a manager. And then when the growth slows down to 10%, that now it doesn't take 2 years now, it takes 4 years or 5 years, and people feel like they've been promised something that's no longer being delivered. And so that can be a very challenging transition as well, even though the company's still doing very well. Any other thoughts on Anthony's question? No? Okay, another one here. So we've got one at the front, and then after that we'll take the lady at the back.
Do you think leadership can be coached, or is it an attribute that people either have or don't have? And part of the reason I ask is I've worked with some very inexperienced junior people who just have some form of leadership that comes through even though they're in the first year of their career.
Absolutely not.
Say more?
Well, I mean, that's like, I wouldn't be in the education business if I didn't think people couldn't grow into roles, right? Not everyone's going to be able to grow into all of the roles, but this idea that leaders are born, not made, reifies some really ugly status quo stuff that I truly don't buy into, right? We can always develop and change. It's sort of like the nature-nurture conversation. If it's all nature, then like the whole education system should just sort of pack up and go home, right? We know how to build skills and abilities and competence in domains, especially interpersonally. Those are socially learned skills, right? Babies don't know their hands belong to them, right? They are born leaders. These are all things that we learn. So those people who you see having great leadership skills in their first year just had experiences before that taught them how to behave that way.
And my experience on that is often it's because they've come through an elite education process that has taught them leadership skills in the way that the state system doesn't. And so it's incumbent upon us to give people those opportunities in their early career.
Yeah, I would pick up on that and say I think it's a nurtured skill. So you can have people that, let's say, start university even, and they've already done a lot of leadership. Maybe they've run their local cookie cutter factory, or they've done potato farming, whatever, like these extracurricular things.
So it's so specific.
These are things that you learn your skills with.
Yeah, no cookie cutting, but yeah, I think there is so much value that you can build up from, let's say you roll up your sleeves at university and become a president of a random society or a treasurer, and you learn some of those skills and you start to nurture it without being so aware of it. And then the other part is I often find that some of the best leaders within our team or within teams, they are often a bit reluctant to be the leader. You have to nudge them a little bit to be like, yeah, why don't you do it? We all listen to you anyway, so why don't you lead this function? And I think it's basically, it relies on us sometimes nudging some people because they can be really good leaders. They're not the sort of Trump charisma guy, but they're this maybe sometimes overlooked, or they're sometimes like not the first one to volunteer, but they can become really good leaders, very caring, empathetic, or really inspiring even.
I think for me the answer to that question is take a sample of leaders that you admire and track backwards in time as to where they came from, and I think more often than not they've been forged by their experiences. Often, you could do that for our portfolio, and the backgrounds would be really surprising. Actually, there's a cohort that have come out of big corporates where this is taught. There's a way of doing things which transfers really well into into smaller growth businesses, a structure, a discipline, and but also a way of thinking about people more holistically than you might do otherwise. There's also a group of people who've come from weird and wonderful backgrounds of, that are military service, or they've come from a professional services role into a line management role, or they founded a business they were 21 and this is 25 years down the line. So I think it can, I would say it can be learned as well, but that doesn't always mean it's been taught.
Great. Question at the back?
I'd like to go back to the topic of capability. So Henrik, I think you mentioned earlier that as part of your hiring process, you're speaking to candidates and almost try to anticipate, will they be able to learn the skills that are important for the business in 12 months' time? And I guess when you're a small business, things are moving very quickly. It's not uncommon for the business to be growing faster than the skills of the team. So just interested to hear from the panel if they have any recommendations or advice to founding teams in terms of how they can get ahead of that.
Great. Yes, I'm happy to start. I'm sure you have a lot to add to it, Celia. Maybe you should go first, actually. Yeah. I think what we do is we find that you can hire for skill set and get it right for a short period of time. Well, if you look at this sort of attitude piece and the ability to learn, so it's the rate of change of learning, then in our case, it outperforms over time. And so what we try to do is do very practical things to learn about the attitude, and the behavior becomes the deciding thing. Then yes, once they are, let's say they're brought on board and they have the right attitude for this company, then we try to supplement. So obviously manager one-on-ones like once a week. It sounds very simple, but it's hard in a startup to implement. It really is really valuable to try and do. It can be quick, 10 minutes, can be an hour. But within those, we then try to match them up with people who have either gone through this journey where their role started changing and you kind of feel the floor changing underneath you, and they feed in with input. Oh, try and read this article, try and go to this program. And for myself, it was difficult going from being a scientist and an engineer to taking the commercial lead. So I did this sort of enterprise fellowship, stuff like that. Well, the enterprise fellowship was from the Royal Academy of Engineering, but doing these programs that are alongside your full-time work can be really helpful. It doesn't have to be a specific enterprise fellowship. It can be training from an entrepreneurship program or a business school, something else. I guess that's your cue, but yeah. Yeah.
Do you know any good business schools?
Well, I think that there are some, I like how you say attitude. There's certain orientations, there's certain personality dispositions that I also think can be developed. But if you have them, you're going to be a lot more likely to be able to pivot and grow. So do you have a growth orientation? Do you have a learning mindset? Are you highly proactive? Are you optimistic? Right? All of these increase resilience and your ability to sort of roll with the punches. So when I'm of course, we come from a foundation where we can get people with horsepower, right? But it's not just the horsepower. You need the horsepower and the attitude to be able to thrive in a really dynamic environment. When I write letters of recommendation now, I try and, so long as I think it's true, and I try and find a story that captures that, because it's not easily quantified, and we don't take exams in it. Right, but I'll find some story. I have one of my former PhD students. I talk about how he started as my RA, and when I was leaving Boston to come back to London, I had this big box of papers, and he took it to the FedEx thing, and it was going to cost like what he thought was too much. So he took this 50-pound box of papers across the Charles River to do it by Royal Mail for less money to save my research budget. And I was like, okay, this is someone who you want on your team, because you need to get people with the right orientations to thrive in that environment.
Brilliant.
I certainly subscribe to you need the combination of the skill and the will to sort of stay ahead of the curve. A sort of practical thing that we try and do is, I've talked before about you always have a rate limiting factor. You can't develop every part of your business at the same rate. So understanding how you pick where that rate limiting factor is and focus your attention on that area. It might be a product or a department or whatever it might be for a period of time, I think is helpful. We often talk about, setting a great strategy is just first base. The harder bit is how you hardwire that into the organisation, the process of constantly thinking, how well are we delivering against that strategy? And crucially, when we're not, what do we do? And one of the very hardest things to do is to have a conversation which is blame-free root cause analysis. There's the most common technique we use is the 5 whys. I mean, Simon Sinek sort of popularised it, but I think it's an incredibly powerful unlocker. And when you do those 5 whys, 75% of the time it's a people issue. Someone has not been set up for success. The team isn't big enough. Leadership isn't connected to the strategy. Someone doesn't have the skills, or those skills aren't being applied in the right way. I find that combination of focusing on the rate limiting factor and really digging into why something isn't delivering what you think it should deliver actually gets you to the right answer from a talent perspective sooner, I think.
Right, we're almost out of time. We've covered an enormous amount of ground, and I'm sure it's going to be very difficult for our audience to remember the key things they need to do differently tomorrow. So I want to wrap up by asking each of you, in a very, very short sentence, if there's one thing that you think leaders in scale-ups or startups should spend more time on than they might naturally do, what would that one thing be? Henrik.
Great. So I think design 100 experiments and track the output of these experiments with something that's quantifiable, even if it's an employee net promoter score, and then go and play, go and have fun. Think of how you can be more diverse, inclusive, and perform better in the end.
Good, that's long enough. Excellent, next one.
Find yourself time to think, whether that's using someone to help you do that, doing it as a team. Good things come out of quality time.
Great.
So that was going to be mine, so I can use my second, which is find ways to think differently. So read fiction, talk to someone you've never spoken to before, get your brain out of the normal way of thinking.
Brilliant. Well, thank you for our online audience. Thank you for the audience in the room for spending your time with us. And most importantly, thank you to our fabulous panel. It's been a great discussion.
Thank you.
Thanks.